Help us to always rely on you. Help these words to be an encouragement to someone here today. In Jesus' name, amen. Recently I read an article by Clifford Goldstein. I love to read his articles. Sometimes they're way above what I can think. But this one was about evil and the existence of evil. And he said, and I tend to agree, that there can't be a reason for evil. Because as soon as you give it a reason, you give it some worth. It makes it possible. Sometimes, there is always, the way God created us, there's always the possibility of committing evil. He's given us free choice, but it's our choice. And as long as we're on God's side and choose His way, He'll lead us. I take comfort in the text like we had today. It's been one of my favorite texts through my whole life, Romans 8:28. And then on in the other part of it. Because we know that even though our lives here may not have the physical, the creature comforts, that we can always be sustained through the spiritual comfort that God gives us through His sacrifice and knowing His promises. For as far back as there exists recorded history, there have been wars. There was even war in heaven, which was the predecessor of all wars. Wars have shaped nations. Wars have shaped many individual lives, as it has my own. For background on my own story, I'll have to tell you the stories of my parents. My mother was the firstborn into a loving and religious family of the Hungarian Reformed Church. This is a Calvinist, earn your salvation religion. Her parents were Hungarians who, because of political disputes over territory, lived in what was then Yugoslavia. The part of Yugoslavia that I was born in, my mother was born in, has been back and forth between Hungary and Yugoslavia for many years. So actually, I'm Hungarian descent, but just happened to be born in a wrong place. Similar things happen like in Croatia, Kosovo, those things are all that same type of war. When I was just 2 years old, when she was just 2 years old, her mother died in childbirth. And soon thereafter, her father remarried, and more children were born to this couple. But when she was 7 years old, her father was also killed, and this was just at the beginning of World War I. She was no longer wanted, and she was very severely beaten and abused by her stepmother, to the point that she was unconscious and had to be rescued by family. Her aunt on her mother's side came to her rescue and took her home. And so she joined a family of 5 other children, and she was 10 years younger than the youngest of their children. She was well cared for, but there were still problems. As all her cousins married, she was expected to stay single so that she could take care of her adopted parents in their old age. And this was the European type custom. Now, through all these years, she attended the Reformed Church and was a faithful member. And now to go to my father's side of the family. My father was born in 1899. And he was involved in the Bolshevik Revolution. Matter of fact, because of his ties and nobility of his family, he became, at the age of 17, a lieutenant in the army. Of course, his side lost. And once that happened, he was forced to flee. All of their property, all of their possessions were confiscated, and if he wanted to stay alive, he had to leave the country. So he fled to Serbia, the Serbian part of Yugoslavia, which we know now as Serbia. And I presume it was because the languages are quite similar. And when I was a child, I spoke fluent Russian. And when we came to the States, I learned the Serbian and Croatian languages. So, and they're very similar, but also quite different. But they're both Slavic languages. When he moved to Serbia, there he met my mother. Of course, it wasn't until many years later. He was 40 and my mother was 30 when they were married, and 2 years later I was born. But by that time, my dad had enlisted in Hitler's army. Even though he lived in Yugoslavia, Hitler had promised the Russians that he would return their land to them by conquering the communists, and so he could be repatriated. That didn't happen, but that's what made him enlist in that army. Actually, there were probably about 1 million soldiers who were Russians who were looking forward to that day when he would conquer the communists. When I was a little over 2 years old, we had to flee Yugoslavia because of my father's affiliation with Hitler. And so we headed out to kind of follow behind the troops. And we had to travel. Since we didn't have anything, my mother had me, and she was already pregnant with my sister. We hitched a ride with our neighbors who happened to have a cart. And if you've ever seen these little Yugoslavian carts with big wooden wheels and stakes in the corners and boards across them, well, that's what we rode on. And we traveled all across the northern part of Yugoslavia, headed west through the Italian Alps. And by this time, the weather was getting really bad. It was midwinter. It was probably January, December or January. By this time, my mother was very pregnant, and we had quite an arrangement there. We slept under a tree for a couple of months, or it was several weeks, until the snow melted enough for us to be able to travel on. And I can still remember this little place. It was the branches stuck out, and under the tree there was no snow, just the, what do you call them, the pine needles. And my mother had set up her wash tub on that with a big pillow, a down pillow in it, and that's where she slept. And I slept in a baby buggy, which, by the way, she pushed beside the cart most of the time. We had a couple of trunks and a suitcase on the cart, but most of that distance she walked. We finally were able to make it to Czechoslovakia, and there my sister was born in a German field hospital. When my sister was born, my father actually got to see her a couple of times before his capture by the British. Now, at that part of the war, it was at the very end, because this was in February of 1945 when my sister was born. The Russians and the Americans and the British were allies because they were fighting Hitler, the common enemy. And because of my father's ties to Russia from the Bolshevik Revolution, he had been blacklisted. And so because the British knew he was Russian, and this happened to all the Russians that they could get their holds on, they were shipping him back to Russia. Now, my mother had some documents that she could have gotten him out, but because he still thought there was a chance that the Russians would be overthrown, he decided not to leave. Because then he thought he could go back there and bring his whole family and we'd all be happy ever after. Well, that didn't work. He actually went to Russia and he died there. So we never saw him again. Meanwhile, for us, after many harrowing experiences, one of them I remember very distinctly, and not because I actually saw it, but I used to have nightmares when I was a child that I would be just about a foot high and all these people were around me and they were getting ready to trample me. And for years and years I dreamt that until I was almost a teenager. And finally, my mother told me what had happened during that time. When my dad was captured by the British, we were also taken prisoners. And they wanted to send all of us to Russia. And my mother knew better, and so she said, no way. Well, they tried to intimidate in a very strong way all the people that refused to go. And so they put us into an enclosure, and I can remember the barbed wire fencing. And we were in an enclosure, and then they put all the women and children in the middle. And from the outside edges, a big tank came in and started rolling over people. And these were the British, you know. So anyway, I hadn't actually seen that, but my mother was in that, we were in that, and she was hanging frantically on to both of us. My sister was just a baby, and I was just a toddler, about 3 years old, and or not quite, I guess. And she decided she wanted no part of that. And all around the perimeter of this area were soldiers with their guns, ready to shoot people who didn't cooperate or whatever, or somebody who tried to escape. And my mother dragged us out of there and walked up right next to a soldier and parked herself there and said, you know, I'm not going there. Finally, after a while, he told us to go back to our barracks, which was where we were housed, was in barracks, and let her go out. I have no idea what happened to the other people, but that was one of the nightmares I used to have as a child. We were to spend about 4.5 years in several different, what they called DP camps, displaced persons, which were refugee camps in Austria, and part of the time in Germany before we came to the States. It was during this time that another Hungarian lady, who'd also lost her husband and might have even been the same battle, who was an Adventist and whose husband had been an Adventist, made friends with my mother. She would try to help with the children, and she was kind and caring, and she would also talk about God. My mother at that point had totally given up believing in God. She couldn't see how a God could permit the things to happen that had happened. She had lost everything that was near and dear to her. Lost her husband, lost all her family. She was left alone with 2 children. So she didn't even want to hear about God. But her friend, Antonia, and I can remember her, would come over and she'd talk, and they'd spend the afternoon talking. A lot of times there wasn't a whole lot to do, especially some seasons of the year when there wasn't work around in the farms or otherwise. And tried to explain to her that this wasn't God that was causing all these problems. And this went on for several months. She'd just talk to her, and my mother never let on that this was affecting her in any way. She had even actually gotten my mother a Bible. And every time Antonia left, she'd open her Bible and read, but she never let on that her heart was being influenced at all. One day, Antonia came over, and it was a Wednesday. And as the conversation came around, it came around to the Sabbath. So she showed my mother in the Bible all the texts about the Sabbath from creation, the 10 Commandments, and even in the New Earth, and that this was something that God had planned for our benefit. And then when Antonia left, my mother opened her Bible and went through all the texts again, and she was thinking, this is it. I mean, this is right. It's got to be right. And she could see the whole picture unfolding of how we were created in love and that it wasn't God's fault. She couldn't blame God for the things that happened to us. And then that very next Friday, we lived in a little barracks that had, by that time, we had our own little room. The partitions came up about 6 feet or so, and if we climbed up in the top bunk, we could look over in the neighbor's room. And we were housed in families like that in these barracks. But anyway, we had our little room, and that Friday my mother was scrubbing the floor, and Antonia stopped by. And my mother was just all excited. And she had never really shown anything before. And she said, "Do you see what I'm doing?" I said, "Yeah, you're washing the floor." My mother always tried to keep our little corner of the world clean, and so it wasn't anything new that she was trying to straighten things up. But she says, "Do you know why I'm doing it today?" And she said, the Sabbath is coming. And then finally Antonia realized that all these months that she had been studying with my mom, that it had been having an influence on her. Well, Antonia wanted to get us to church, and the closest church was almost 4.5 miles away, and it was all uphill. Only one way, but it was getting there. Coming back was all downhill. And my sister was probably 1.5 years old or something, and I was 3.5 old, going on 4. So it was pretty rough. We had to walk 4.5 miles, and it wasn't all nice paved road. It was mostly a path until you got into the city. And it was in a beautiful setting in the Alps. Now, the church itself wasn't such a beautiful setting. They met in a dance hall that was transformed every Sabbath morning when we'd go in, and this didn't happen for a while. They'd be sweeping away cigarette butts and cleaning up and putting chairs in for us to have the service. Anyway, she wanted to take us to church, and it was probably about 3 or 4 months, and we just could never make it. For one reason or another, we never made it to church. One Sabbath, and I remember this, my mother had gotten me dressed first and was getting my sister ready to go. And it had rained the night before. And she told me to go sit by the door outside. Well, instead of sitting, I walked right into a mud puddle and started stomping on it, and my only dress got totally splattered, so we weren't able to go to church that Sabbath. I'm sure she was very disappointed. Then one week, Antonia said, "Now I'm going to come over and I'll help you get ready, and I'll watch one while you're getting the other one ready." And so the next Sabbath morning, she came over. But before that, my mother had gotten up very early and had gotten us both ready. And by the time Antonia got there, we were all ready for church waiting. So we did our hike up the mountain. And I can remember many times that we did go to church. My mother carried me on her shoulders and my sister in her arms. And my mother was 4'10", or 11, maybe, stretching it before she shrunk a lot. She never got to be 5 feet tall. And so she'd carry me on her shoulders and then my sister in her arms, and trudging up this mountain trail until we got to the city. So that was our introduction to church. But this was her very first Sabbath that we got there. And since she didn't have a quarterly and didn't have any idea of what went on, we got there in time for Sabbath school. And the Sabbath school lesson was on Leviticus. And we had a very difficult time getting enough to eat. And so we were given ration tickets to get a certain amount of this, certain amount of that, meat, and even potatoes and other vegetables. They gave us ration tickets for alcoholic beverages and tobacco, cigarettes, or whatever you wanted to buy. Now those my mother did real well on, because people would do anything to satisfy their vices. And because they did that, we benefited from that. There was a black market, and she could sell her cigarette and liquor tickets, and we could have food. And one of the things was, of course, the meat. And most of the time, it was something like sausage or, whatever you could get. My mother was Hungarian, and they have a type of sausage that she grew up on that she loved. And, whenever we had a meat ration, that's what she got. And here they were talking about, among other things, not eating pork. And she just didn't know what to do with herself. She said, how am I going to survive? And then she thought about everything else that she had lost and had come through, all those challenges. And she'd lost her husband. We'd left all of our possessions in Yugoslavia. We came out with 2 little suitcases and a trunk with some linens and things. And some things I still have from those trunks. And so this battle went on in her mind during church. And finally she said, I've lost everything else, and the Lord has taken care of me. He's brought me to this point. And before that church service was over, she decided she would never touch an unclean meat again. We did get a subsistence level of food, and this carried over with me for a long time, because in the morning we had cornmeal mush. At lunchtime it was cubed or sliced and fried, and at supper time we got it in a broth. And for 4 years, that was our staple diet, except for what we could buy. Now, even if you had the ration tickets, that didn't guarantee that you could get that. You also had to have money, and that's why my mother made out well, because she could sell what she didn't want and get other things for us. But I think I was probably 30s before I could even look cornbread or anything with corn in it in the face. Anyway, to supplement what meager food we had, the allowance that we had, we did a lot of creative things to get food. And I remember going out in the woods after every rain and hunting mushrooms. And my mother had us singing little songs. Here, little mushroom, 4 years old, and I was hunting mushrooms. And we played games, who'd find the first mushroom, or who'd find the biggest mushroom, and we had a little basket, we put them in, and so we ate mushrooms. And in season, we had the different fruits and berries that grew wild. We used to pick blueberries in the fall, the wild ones. And one time I actually was picking berries, and I thought my mother was on the other side of the bush, and it was making an awful lot of noise. And I peeked around, and it was a bear. So we all got out of that and made sure it was a small bear, and we thought, oh boy, Mama Bear's somewhere. Which way do we go so we don't come between them? But we got out of there real fast and let the bear have the berries. We picked chicory, dandelions, all these things that my mother learned, everything that was edible, and we would go out and forage for these things. Besides that, every once in a while she could get work on the nearby farms in the area, and either planting or harvesting. Well, one time when she was doing this, it was in the fall, and she got a job pulling carrots. And sometimes she would get some cash, but sometimes she would get paid in the produce that she helped harvest. And this time she brought home a whole bushel of carrots. Now this was our winter supply for the 3 of us. It was supposed to last us through the worst of the winter, and we didn't have a refrigerator, and we didn't really need one, because the room that we had was not insulated. Matter of fact, we stuffed newspapers in between the boards to keep the wind from coming in. We did have a little stove in there, but you had to be right by the stove to be warm. So she put this bushel of carrots under the bed, way up against the cold wall, and left them there until we would need them, several weeks later when the weather was bad and there was no food. And then one day she went under the bed and started to pull out the bushel of carrots. And it felt very light. And so she pulled it out all the way, and there were just a few carrots covering the bottom of the bushel. So she turned to me and said, "Do you know what happened to these carrots?" And of course, I had to confess. A lot of the times we were pretty hungry. And I had had the time of my life for 3 or 4 weeks, eating several carrots a day and giving my sister what she would have. These were raw carrots, and we just ate them until there was almost nothing left. My mother cried, but what could she say? She did forgive me, and I'm here to tell the story. During those years that we were in those refugee camps, and then the other thing about those refugee camps, they would come along one afternoon and say, "Okay, people with this letter of the alphabet, whose last names were this letter of the alphabet, be ready at 7 o'clock in the morning to board the army trucks to take you to the next camp." Because as the refugee population diminished, they would close some of the camps and they would consolidate in other places. So I think we were in a total of probably about 7 different camps during those 4.5 years. So every few months, we'd say, "Okay, you go on to the next one." And I remember riding in the backs of those, they were army trucks. And I always tried to get the seat right by the tailgate, sitting on that trunk and almost bouncing out a few times. So anyway, that was how we were moved. But anyway, during those years that we were in those camps, we went to a lot of travelogues, or so-called. All the different countries that were taking refugees would put on a film program or something. And so my mother would go to one, and then the other, and then the other. Now, we had relatives in Canada, we had relatives in Australia, and we had relatives in Uruguay. And these were all her step-brothers and sisters from her adopted family that had gone to these other countries. But none of those countries were accepting a single mom with 2 little kids. And besides that, my mother only had a 3rd grade education. She was not allowed to continue because she was supposed to stay home and take care of her adopted parents. So she never got to go to school beyond the 3rd grade. Finally, we got a sponsorship from the Yugoslavian church in New York City. And it was through an elder Maggie, and I wish I could remember his full name, who found sponsors for thousands, several thousand Adventist families to come to the States. But before that, while we were still in Austria, my mother finally was baptized. And I have her baptismal certificate with me here if somebody wants to read it in German. But anyway, I still have a copy of that. And then when we found our sponsorship, we were sent to Germany, and we spent several months there in transit, waiting for all the paperwork to come through. It was getting close to Christmas, and probably none of you ever remember because you're not that old. But way back, right after the war, the Red Cross here in the States would send little shoebox care packages to refugee children in Europe. And I got my box when we were in Germany. And I can still remember that little shoebox and seeing my very first toothbrush, very first time in my life. And I was 7 years old by then. And there were other little things in there. There was a little comb and a little toy. And when we came to the States, I remember my mother said, you know, we got those. And she always made sure, no matter what else we had to skip, that we put something in one of those boxes, because that went on till the 50s or something, into the mid-50s. Anyway, after spending several months in, I think it was Hamburg, we finally boarded ship, and it was like the 26th of, I don't know, it was, 26th of November or something like that. And we made that winter crossing on the Atlantic. And this was a troop ship that, well, they call it converted, but I don't know if it was really converted, because there were these huge, huge rooms with triple-tier bunks. And there were hundreds of people in the same room. I mean, there'd be a couple hundred, 2, 3, but it was wall-to-wall bunks. And that's how we made the trip over to the States. Now, my mother was seasick the whole time. And because she couldn't take care of us, my sister and I got to spend a couple of nights in the infirmary. Rather than take her away from us, they gave her a chance to get better. But she still had a hard time with the crossing. And after that, my sister and I had the run of the ship. And we even had a huge hailstorm with, golf ball size, almost tennis ball size hail. And they locked all the doors, and we were told not to go out on deck. And I remember trying to push that door open, and I actually saw the water coming up on the deck because the ship was going every which way. And but anyway, the Lord preserved me through that too. Now, you kids, don't follow my example. Do what your moms tell you to do, but my mom wasn't there to tell me what to do because she wasn't feeling well. Well, we finally landed in New York. It was December 6th. My mother had spent her birthday heaving on board. And there to meet us was the pastor of the little Yugoslavian church. His name was Elder Konachki. He picked us up, got us through, after we went through all the immigration and everything. And one of our suitcases turned up missing. And it was a suitcase that had all my earthly possessions that I ever cared about. It was my toys from the time I was a baby. Things that we had gotten before the war that we could probably never replace again. And it was just small, probably no bigger than this pulpit here. And they couldn't find that. And it wasn't till a year later that we heard from the immigration service that they had our suitcase. But they wanted $25. Now, this was in 1950. My mother only made $28 a week. And it was like impossible. And I think I cried for weeks, but even though I still remember it, I'm not really sorry that I lost it. Because I can still remember my little pigskin doll and my little rooster that crowed when I squeezed his tummy and the little bear that went, whoa, when I squeezed him. But anyway, somebody else got my suitcase because we could not afford it. When we got out, I had my very first ride in a car. Got into Elder Konachki's 1948-49 with the little windows. It was black. And he took us to his house. Now, I had probably seen houses before, but it had never occurred to me that people lived in those places. So when we got there, I said to my mother, whose barracks is that? Because I didn't know that people lived in houses. Or even what a house was, totally. And if it had not been for Elder Konachki and that little church with only 28 members who took us in and took care of us, I don't know where I'd be today. You know, we depend so much on people. You know, the Lord gets us through, but He uses people to get us through difficulties and challenges that we face. Be they economic challenges, emotional challenges, spiritual challenges as well, too. Oh, I've got to back up because I got to tell this story. When we were on this ship, one of the stewards was a black man. And he was real big and a little bit heavy, and I had never, ever in my life seen a black person before. And so I wanted to see if he felt different. So, you know, I said, you know, I was shy as a kid, but about some things, but not. So I went up there, you know, and asked him if I could touch his hand. And at that point, we both spoke Russian. He spoke fluent Russian, so we could communicate with him. And then I was looking at his hair, and it was all kinky, and I'm thinking, well, how does that feel, or what's that like? And so he picked me up, and he let me feel his hair. And we were fast friends from that time on. We were not allowed to take food out of the dining area. And so he was stationed at the door, and we would always stop and talk to him. And everything that he took away from other people, we'd get a little extra. It was the first time I had an orange, and lots of apples, but any little piece of fruit or something like that that people were trying to sneak out of the dining area, we used to benefit by that. So it was quite an interesting experience, and I can just think back now, and he was so nice. And it always gave me a good impression of black people, or people in general, the potential in people. You know, it's not what you look like or who you are, it's how you treat people. And he was very kind and considerate. Anyway, Pastor Konachki lived right around the corner from Greater New York Academy. And I thought I'd add that. And every once in a while, during the almost 7 years that we lived in New York, we'd get to go out to a Saturday night program or something. But I was never able to attend church school because we just couldn't afford it. During that time, Elder Konachki had two churches. He had one in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and then he had the Yugoslavian church in Queens. And many, many Sabbaths, they would let me tag along, he and his wife. They had no children, and they were an older couple anyway. And I would go, and then she'd have me like tell a children's story, or do something, or sing a song, and she was the one that kind of nurtured me along. Our Sabbath school consisted of my sister and myself. We were the only children in the church at the time. The others were all older. There was one teenage girl, and there were older ones in their 20s, and then the old folks. But she nurtured me. She gave me my first taste of avocado. And that was back in the 50s, like mid-50s, and they were kind of rare and very expensive. I would, just to look at an avocado back in those days, I'd say, wow, I wish I could be rich, rich enough to eat an avocado. And then she gave me a piece of hers. In August or September, I don't exactly remember when, it was late summer of 1956, Pastor Konachki made a visit to our home. This visit was going to bring sadness and relief to us. He brought a letter, and it was a letter from my father that he had written back in January or February of that year. But because a lot of people didn't know where we had gone to, we'd just kind of fallen off the map, and we didn't contact We weren't in contact with certain parts of our family. This letter had gone back to Yugoslavia first, and then gone to all the family members, and finally somebody remembered that we were in Austria, and it went to different people that we knew along the way until it finally made its way. And it came to Antonia, but she didn't want to deliver it. So she gave it to the pastor, and he came. And in that letter, my dad said that he had been released from prison. Now, we came to find out much later that people were only released when they were dying. But we didn't know that at that point. And within days, Pastor Konachki was helping us to go through the immigration papers and trying to see if we could bring him over here. And we knew nothing of his condition. And then little by little, we heard things from other people whose husbands had been taken. A friend of my mother's in Germany, and Antonia's first husband. He never made it out, but different people who had been released and had gone back home after 12 years of captivity and just went home to die. And one friend in particular of my mother's in Germany who said she was sorry her husband never got out because he was a total invalid. He was bedfast, and I mean he died within a few months. But here she had to care for him, and it was just. And she was struggling, to make a go of life and to keep fed and everything. And then here she had this other added burden. And my mother was hearing these stories. But we were still hoping that my dad would come. They exchanged about 3 letters. He was only allowed to write once a month. So we got 2 more letters after that. Then we moved to Ohio. And even though the move was not under the best of circumstances, and things didn't work out as we had planned there, it was still a blessing because finally when we moved to Ohio, I was able to go to church school. We moved to first in a little country town. It was Chesterland, Ohio. Probably no one's ever heard of it. And back then it consisted of a bowling alley and a bar and a couple of houses or something. It's much bigger now. But anyway, we moved there, and we lived there for about 6 weeks, and then we had to move. So we moved into Cleveland, and that's when I finally got to church school. We went to the Cleveland First Church. And people there thought that we needed to be in church school, so they helped my mom with a large portion of the tuition because we couldn't have afforded it. Anyway, when we moved there, we had been there for a while, and we got another letter from Russia. Of course, it was in an envelope that had been forwarded by our pastor, Pastor Konachki. My mother opened it. It was a letter in Russian, and it was not in my father's handwriting. And it had been several months, almost a year, since we had heard about my dad. And so she opened the letter, and we found out that he had died. His roommate, who was only allowed to write 1 letter a month, had finally sacrificed that 1 letter after several months to write to my mother and let her know that my father had passed away and the circumstances. And we had sent photos to him of each of us, and he described how he slept with those photos under his pillow, and that when he was dying he had those in his hand. I wish I'd had a picture of him, but we never got one. Anyway, then our life my mother all this time didn't know whether she was a widow or whether he'd make it back or what. We always hoped. In his last letter to my mom, he had said that he did have a hope of seeing us in heaven, and mentioned Christ's coming, and that if we weren't to meet here, that we would meet in heaven again. And we don't really know where he was coming from with that. There is a small possibility, or even a medium-sized possibility, I guess, that Antonia's husband, who was taken captive at the same time, might have gotten to know my father in prison. And maybe both of them experienced that conversion. Or someone did. And my father was Russian Orthodox. And so it's a lot like Catholic, except they have their own pope. But anyway, so that part of our life experience was finished. So now we knew that he'd never come back. All those years that we were in New York, and even after we moved, my mother, I can remember seeing her sitting and reading her Bible for long periods of time and praying. I don't know how many times I saw her praying and sometimes crying, kneeling at the side of her bed. And I know all those influences that came on me when we lived in New York, because I didn't have any friends that knew any better, and I didn't always choose the right friends. Were leading me far, far away from the Lord. So our move to Ohio was providential, I'm sure, that the Lord led in that. I don't think I'll tell any more of that story, because I'm here. I did get to go to church school. I went to an academy, graduated from academy, met a wonderful Christian husband, and all those stories I could tell. And, you know, I can see you looking at me and somebody saying, boy, what a tough life, you know. I think each one of us has things in our lives that are just as tough. They might not be physical privation or not having the earthly, worldly things. They might be other things. I mean, we all have hurts, all have things that happen in our families. In this world, we're all going to lose family members. You know, I think of you. That's heartbreaking. Each one of us has to face those heartbreaks and things. So in some ways, yes, it's been a hard life, but the Lord has gotten us through it. And I think if we dedicate our lives to Him, and even if we, you know, so many times we pray for things. We want a better job. We want to do something better or make more money or be able to live in more comfortable circumstances. But that's not what we're here for. And going back to our text, I think he's speaking more of spiritual things, not just the physical things that we think we need here in this earth. And God doesn't always answer those prayers. But when we give our lives to Him, He always takes care of us and gets us through. One of my favorite texts also, and I know I've shed a few tears. I shed a few tears writing this story down because it brought back so many memories. But one of my favorite texts is Revelation 21:4. And it says, "And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain.